Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, we are so excited to be joined by Dr. Alyssa, who has a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Georgia. And the reason I'm so excited about talking with Alyssa is that I think now more than ever, it is so important to be very mindful of who you follow on social media, just by the messaging that and the vibes that they provide. And when I watch Alyssa's content, I see an abundance mindset. I see a positivity. I see a look at how much can be done when you're fueling yourself. And it's so inspiring, Alyssa. And so I hope that this conversation helps encourage people to just be very mindful of who they're following, because the type of messaging that you're seeing day to day on your scrolling, that's drilling into your head quite a bit. And so today, we're really excited to dive into why it is so important to be fueling yourself, especially if you have any sort of exercise pursuits. And do you want to get us started?
We just wanted to start off a little bit learning about you. So your background in fitness, health, nutrition, and how you got to the place that you are today.
So I've learned by now to give the Cliff Notes version of this because it seems like I have a very long story. So I essentially, I grew up an athlete. I played lacrosse. That was my big main sport. Ran cross country, track, tri-letter athlete in high school. And it was during high school where I really fell in love with fitness and running. As the story goes, I, started running on my own outside of lacrosse and was like, wow, I feel like I caught lightning in a bottle. And I wanted to just kind of share that with everyone. And I kind of just followed that for the rest of my life. I actually didn't originally plan to go into my field, but I think I was destined to always be in fitness in some way or another. And so I actually went to college as an athlete. And I ended up quitting my lacrosse team and being kind of what I called a full-time nerd. I had the highest GPA and the lowest playing time on the team. And I knew grad school was more in my future than athletics. But I was really heartbroken because I love sports and fitness and exercise and training so much. There's this narrative that when you quit sports, you're done being an athlete. And that couldn't be further from the truth for those that want to continue to be athletic or feel like, okay, well, I didn't do it growing up, or I never did it. I can't be athletic or fit now. It's too late for me. And that neither of those are true. And so through that, I kind of kept following my love of fitness and dabbling in just about everything under the sun, while I also pursued a master's, grad, and PhD in exercise physiology, and then completed a postdoc as well after that. And so throughout the years of doing all this research and training and studying, I've also done, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting meets, a strongman in college, and I run ultra marathons. I actually just finished my first 100-mile ultra marathon 3 weeks ago. So a lot of everything I've done under the sun, from CrossFit to trail and ultra running to powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting. I really love the pursuit of our bodies, our limits, seeing what we can do. I think we learn a lot about ourselves through the pursuit of fitness. And then, for me, I am fascinated and obsessed and love the physiology of the human body, and I'm obsessed with exercise. And so much so that I wanted to truly learn as much as I possibly could about it. And for me, everything I do on my platform is a marriage of that science-based training that I have, but also that practical application, and then just a deep-rooted desire I want to share this with people. I want them to catch that lightning in the bottle that I found, but I want them to do it in a smart, effective, less shame-filled way.
Right. And it's so opposite of what you see many people talk about today, where, I feel like a lot of the health world right now is so focused on fear-based and avoiding this toxin. And it just becomes this never-ending rabbit hole of restrict, 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 restrict. And that's a very scary, dogmatic, not fulfilling path to go down. Whereas instead, the content that you share is much more inspiring and uplifting of look at what the body can achieve if you fuel it properly and actually work with the physiology.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for your kind words as well.
I know that
I really appreciate it.
It's honestly really rare to see an account like yours. So I think we're just really trying to encourage people to find more people like you. Just because so many of our followers have been blown away by the Minnesota starvation experiment episodes we've been doing. And they are kind of in the state of like, well, I haven't really seen this from anybody else. And they don't. Okay, a lot of people are maybe going down a health journey, or they're trying to, lose some weight or get into their fitness, but they're not seeing themselves as an athlete. Like you said, just because you quit playing a sport, or maybe you never even played a sport to begin with, that doesn't mean that you can't identify with being an athlete. And when you start to identify as an athlete, perhaps your viewpoint on how you feel yourself will shift away from just trying to be skinny or just trying to, accomplish some health goal. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask you was, I know that you work a lot with people in their training, but what's been your experience with these women that you come across through your journey when they're coming to you for training advice, or maybe they're trying to, get stronger or work on their running? How often do you see that they're limiting themselves because they're not properly fueling their training?
Yeah. So for the listeners here, I'll give some context. I do offer a lot of more. I kind of stick in my lane from a business perspective from offering just coaching and training from exercise, but I do have formal training in nutrition and metabolism and sports nutrition specifically and female physiology. So I just want to make sure that people know, I didn't really allude to that earlier. Like, I'm not just speaking here from a lens of like, oh, I'm working with people, but like kind of bringing in the science here as well. And so I see this a lot either on my platform. I want to say Instagram more often than not. I actually see more of this though than in my coaching programs, because I think what happens is when people find my account and they come to me, it is, kind of what you guys were alluding to. Like, it's different than the messaging that they've seen in the past and what they even knew was possible. They didn't even know that this version of fitness existed. And so it starts to change in their mind and shift the way they view and think about things. And so I do feel like by the time they come to me in my training programs or start training with us, they've kind of are graduating into that mindset. But I do think that there is a subset of either the people who have either struggled with their body composition or weight for most of their life, and they really struggle with the right way to eat without restricting and wanting to perform at the same period of time, or they've done all the yo-yo diets or the different cycling things. They want to know, well, how can I support these body composition goals and my performance at the same time? Or you do have the more lean, quintessential classic, lifelong, high volume chaser athlete female who still struggles with the idea of eating more. I think especially for a lot of women, that idea of how much carbohydrate or calories in total you need to eat in order to support training goals, even if they feel like they're eating enough or a lot, it still is very uncomfortable for them. So I do want to acknowledge that even people who come from athletic backgrounds, athletes, people identify as that, there's still so much under eating and body imagery issues, and athletes are people who identify with that. But I think really taking that performance lens and recognizing that food is fuel, which is a really cliche thing to say because it can feel really empty and mean nothing. But food is the thing that is allowing you to train and perform and make fitness progress and recover. And I think everyone nowadays are looking for these recovery hacks or these magical fixes or things to get better. And often, I'm constantly finding myself having to remind women in my messaging that sometimes it's not the training that's the issue. It's the food being mismatched with that training that is either hurting your hormones or not allowing you to recover or not allowing you to make progress. And that if you just trust me a little bit, and usually it's the carbs and calories that I'm like, just bump those up. It's scary, right? To do it. I think with a lot of things, either pulling back volume or increasing food for a lot of those do-it-aller extremist type people feels hard because they really have that control over everything that they've been doing. High volume training and really controlling your eating is like all they know, and letting go of that death grip can feel really hard. And I think that sometimes just takes a lot of compassion and consistent messaging. And for me, I think leading from the front and showing them an example of somebody who consistently is training hard, eating a lot of food, eating a ton of food, sharing how much I'm eating, sharing that, I hate to be body centric in my content. I try not to be. But if you watch me over time, I'm not like making these massive weight fluctuations or gaining a ton of weight because I'm eating a lot when I'm training. Like if anything, I lean out when I'm training at high volumes, even though my calorie intake sometimes goes up by 1,000 calories a day during those training seasons and cycles. And so I think it's really scary because it's so opposite to everything we're told. And I think the biggest thing that what often women do is they take a diet industry mindset to performance focused goals. That's one of the little colloquial things that I say all the time. Instead of taking a performance focused mindset or even a body composition focused mindset to their performance and training goals and doing that. So I think that for me, it's more of that, like they come into my ecosystem online and they're so unfamiliar with what I'm suggesting that they're hesitant at first, but seeing it over and over and over again, I think they start to trust it, right? They start to gain trust in me, of course, as an expert leading that, but seeing, oh, okay, like, well, maybe I'll try that. I'll see that. And they'll do it. They'll bump up their carb intake one day, or they'll eat a little bit more in their long run, or they'll increase their calories. And they realize, well, I'm not gaining weight and I feel a lot better. Or even my menstrual cycle and hormonal impacts on my training are gone or they're better. And I think that if you can just get people to bite a little bit, then you open that door for that curiosity of like, okay, well, how far this can take me. But you really have to gain that trust in a world of avoid this, don't do this, be scared of this. This makes you fat. Like, this is going to kill you. This is destroying your hormones. And it's fear, 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 rather than like, what if you added this thing that could, you know what I mean? Like this magical thing called carbohydrate or whatever it is, calories to what you're doing and seeing how that feels. So yeah, I think it is definitely like a repeated exposure to messaging thing, and you're combating all of that other stuff. And so I do find with some clients, it's a mix of either, you know, hey, you have valuable, valid body composition goals, but you don't want to under restrict or starve yourself or do what you've always done in order to get those. What's the best way you can do that while supporting performance or aligning it with your goals across the year, mixed with, you know, this other cohort of people where it's like, hey, you know what? Actually, you're the kind of person who needs to not think like this. And you need to spend a year not trying to diet, trying to eat more, trying to gain muscle or to support your performance. And so I usually find it's two of those buckets of conversations, depending on the type of people you're talking to.
So I think that it's almost like people need permission to be able to eat more these days. So I have a obsession with looking backwards at what our ancestors did. And you can look at like USDA databases from like early 1900s. And Alyssa, the recommended calorie intake was 3,000 calories. Now, fast forward to today, all of a sudden, all the nutrition labels you see are like based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And then you see, you know, meal plans online for 1,300 calorie diets. And so we've done this huge shift in, you know, eating more is not healthy. And so now, in order to get out of these mindsets, people need to be able to see examples such as yourself. And I hope that we're examples too with how many carbs and calories that we consume. Can you provide, and I know that your training volume fluctuates based on whether you are training for a running event or more of a strength focused event, and you like, you know, dial those up or down based on what your next goal is. Can you provide an example of how much you train during the week and how much food you actually consume?
Yeah, like how you're fueling that.
Yeah.
training.
And so, you know, I think the thing I'll start with is too, I think a lot of the issues for people in our country when it comes to the eating versus overeating versus eating enough thing is it's so easy to overeat the foods that are really high fat and high sugar and high sweet and low nutrient value. And it's really easy to overeat those and then not get the results that we're seeking. And people associate the restrict and then eat that for very dense things with, well, I'm not eating that much, versus I do want to emphasize I eat a lot, but I also eat a lot of, you know, whole foods. I do eat processed stuff. I'm not acting like I'm perfect by any means, but one, I'm that hungry and I need that to meet both my hunger and performance needs and things like that. So I really
celebrate appetite.
Yeah. And so I tell people all the time, I'm like, yeah, like I eat calorically dense things sometimes, but really for the most part, like if I don't eat fruits and vegetables and fiber and volume, I'm hungry. Like I need still like large meals. Someone asked me recently, they're like, don't you feel like eating big salads like that stunts your appetite so you don't eat enough? I was like, girlfriend, I eat this whole salad and it's loaded with calories too. Like I'm beefing up my salads, but I'm like, I'm eating this with the side of like a half a box of pasta. Like this isn't just my only meal, right? So yeah, I have a big appetite. So I think in some people, they struggle with that when they are eating more, and they can use calorically dense things like nut butters or juices or liquid calories or whatever. And that's totally fine too. I choose that as well. But all that to say, so great example. I do track my food and my calories. It's impossible for me to regulate the carbohydrates that I need with my training volume a lot of the time, or I do struggle with getting enough protein in like everyone else, right? So it just helps me keep a tab on things for me. I don't target calories. I kind of track to hunger and then just try to make sure I'm getting in enough protein and then adjusting my carbs or fats or calories overall by how I'm approaching training. So that's kind of my approach to nutrition. You don't have to track to do it, but I know that helps people get context to how I approach this, because I think people think tracking is just restrictive, where my calories are set at 0 on my app. My macros are set to 0.
Well, I feel like if someone doesn't track when they're in this diet mindset, they will naturally undereat, and tracking can be very eye-opening to them. Like, wow, I'm only eating 1,400 calories.
Yeah.
And so I think it's beneficial there for someone that is in that state of being stuck in a diet mindset, because it can help them realize, hey, this is maybe why you're not feeling well. This is maybe why you're not performing well in the gym. And allowing them to see that slowly increase over time can be helpful.
Yeah, and it helps me, I mean, keep tabs. And, for me, I use the Macro Factor app and I track and this is, again, people who are sensitive to this, I track my weight versus my intake, and it will estimate my caloric expenditure based off that. And it allows me to kind of adjust my nutrition based off like a range of where I'd like to be, making sure I'm not overly dropping weight or overly gaining weight at any point in time within my training. So anyway, I just came off this huge training cycle for this 100-miler. And I would say, the peak of my training from last year, we'll say July through the race that I did, I was doing about 3 lifting sessions per week, maybe 2 on weeks that I was traveling a lot. And then I was running between 50 and 70 miles per week. So probably anywhere between 13 to 15 hours of physical activity per week was what I was doing. And I was eating on average during weekdays, probably between 2,700 and 3,000 calories a day. I might have had a low day here or there where my appetite was low and maybe like 2,600 calories a day. And then on weekends, when my training volume was high, I was eating anywhere between, depending on how long my long runs were, like 3,200 to 4,200 calories per day. Especially in those long run days when you factor in that nutrition that I'm eating, and I'm eating between 60 to 80 grams of carbs per hour on those runs. So yeah, I mean, especially towards the peak end of training, I mean, I think my app says my average intake across the board is probably around like 2,800, 3,000 calories a day, mixed with my estimated energy expenditure per day was about 2,800 based by my app. And I'm not perfect about tracking like the 6-day period it needs or my weight. But for me as a metabolism scientist, I think it's cool data to kind of see that fluctuation. It's hard to get that information otherwise. But that's probably where I was at, mixed with, I travel a lot and I take untracked days all the time. And sometimes if I'm really hungry, I'm going to just go crush a ton of food because I'm just like, I am not recovering. Anytime I have a low recovery day, I'll bump up my intake more, even if it seems higher than what I might need. I take that very healthy approach to those things. And so that's probably what I was eating then. Now I am on my second week back of training after my 100-miler, took a full week off, eased back into lifting last week, started tracking again, back at it this week. I'm lifting 4 times a week right now. So bumped up a lifting day, but they're about 45 minutes in duration. I'm doing 3 like Metcon, like high rocks type training cardio workouts right now. And I added back in running this week. So not a ton. I did like 3.5 miles yesterday, 4 miles earlier in this week. I'll probably do maybe an hour run this weekend. So probably about getting back to that 7, 8, 9 hours a week of training. Maybe 6 to 8 is probably a better range there for where I'm at right now. And I have been eating, I want to say for the most part, the last week or two between 2,400 and 2,600 calories a day. So it still seems pretty high to a lot of people based off those things. But what's funny is I've been hungry. I've been adding back in training. I've been hungry. So I've been tinkering more to those 2,600 calorie days because I'm just kind of going with my body at this point in time and seeing where am I at with my training. I'm readjusting that. And so I would say that I'm training a normal regular amount. Caloric intake is usually between 2,400 and 2,600 calories a day. And then moderate gets to like 26 to 28, 29. And then the really, really like I'm training a ton, 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. And I do take the approach of like, I think people think of this as like I'm carb cycling or I'm calorie cycling. I'm not. But the days that I train twice in a day, my calories are definitely getting closer to that, upper limit of that. Or these very, very long run days, it's going to be really high. So it's not that I'm eating less on lower training days or less on rest days. I'm eating more on the days that I'm expending a ton of energy. And so for context though, as well, for people listening to this, I'm 5'1". I'm a petite little thing. But like, I'm not big. I'm not a big person. I'm like about 140 pounds, 140, 145, give or take. I've ranged in a body from 130 to 153 pounds from all my performance goals on a training spectrum. I'm not against gaining weight or losing it if needed, as whatever my body does. I actually prefer to not have it drop too much into the 130s because that means I'm losing muscle. I have a lot of muscle mass, which means that I need a lot of energy to support that and maintain that. But I'm not like people are going to hear this calorie intake. They're going to be like, is this like a 5'7", 190 pound, like linebacker, like type build? And I mean, I am built like a linebacker, but I'm a petite person. And the reason that I have such a high intake is because I have a very high expenditure. And I think people really underrate when it comes to wanting to eat more, how much being a high eater and a high burner can kind of go together, and it kind of allows you the best of both worlds. If you can figure out a way in your training or your life to be a high burner. A lot of people will often say, you know, exercise doesn't contribute to fat loss or weight loss. It's all nutrition. And yes, it is nutrition, but there's something to be said about being someone with a high metabolic flux and a ton of energy expenditure and being able to eat more or need more because of that. I think that messaging often negates, it's confusing for people because they're like, well, exercise doesn't burn calories and contribute to weight loss and fat loss. To some degree, yes, on that little scale of Gen Pop people adding it in. But when you are highly active or very active or becoming active an hour or more per day on average per week, you are highly active and you are going to start expending more and needing more to fill that gap between your activity level and what you're doing. And I think that messaging, that's again, a diet industry messaging people are taking to the performance focused goals. There is to some degree, your body isn't burning calories one for one. So if you burn 800 calories in a training session, which I don't advise people track on their watches, I'm just using this as an example, your body might only they might compensate a little bit with some of your movement or other activity across the day. So it might only be, say, 700 calories, for example. Your body absorbs some of that difference. So it's not always one for one, but it is additive to some degree until you become like Michael Phelps level high training volume, which most of us are not. And so yeah, that's the way I approach it. And I always say eating enough. And people think eating enough means overeating or undereating. And eating enough is eating for the activity demands that you have. It's not overeating and it's not restricting. And so when I pull back, when I'm training less, that's not because I'm restricting myself. It's just because my body needs less energy to sustain what I'm trying to do. So there's my little like soapbox content tangent there on that as well.
I think a huge thing that I noticed in your mindset is that you are an athlete and that you're fueling your performance. And so that is what is allowing you to kind of bypass all these different, diet culture messaging and, be at this specific body weight. Like you said, like you don't even like to drop into the 130s because you want to hold on to your muscle mass, and muscle is expensive. You have to eat more to maintain that muscle. And I think that that's a huge
You're not exercising to burn calories.
Exactly. That's a huge missing component. Like, so you said a lot of people don't have this, or they think that, you don't burn calories when you're exercising, like it's all nutrition. But then there's a segment of people who are literally using exercise to burn calories so they can eat. And I just wish that more and more people could look at it like you, where you're utilizing the food intake in order to exercise and perform at your best.
I eat to train. I don't train to eat. Yeah,
exactly. But unfortunately, just so much of us grown up in, I feel like when Ashley, she's a little bit older than me, but when I was growing up, a lot of the bodybuilding scene was coming into Instagram in like the 2014. And that really negatively impacted my own beginning into my athletic endeavors because everything was focused on aesthetics.
Leaner.
Performance. Yeah. And so it just, to our audience, it's hard. Like we've all seen this messaging. There's so few people like Dr. Alyssa, and there's so many people with the wrong messaging.
So I have a question. Carbs are a huge, big buzzword today, and there's so much debate. We were keto and carnivore at one point in the pursuit of health, and then quickly realized within a year and a half, how certain parts of our physiology, our metabolism, our thyroid, our hair started thinning, our body temperature started going down, hormonal problems, like our system was starting to be dialed down, right? And can you talk from, having a PhD in exercise science, physiology, can you talk about the importance of carbohydrates, not only for fueling, but also for maintaining muscle glycogen, and why that's so important for recovery and physiology as a whole? Like, why do you put so much emphasis on carbohydrates?
Yeah, I know. I feel like I'm the cardio and carb girl, which is so funny because it's like, those are like the two things, but it's because people are so afraid of both of those, which especially women. And it's just like so nonsensical. So I'll start with my disclaimer of like, one, don't come out with pitchforks. I'm not a huge proponent of carnivore. If you want to do keto and you're listening to this, lower fat or higher fat diets in some ways can potentially work. In general, like, people with lower activity levels can probably eat a higher fat diet to maintain satiety and are not needing as many carbohydrates. But when you think about carb needs, it's going to really be dependent and reflective of your activity level. So the more active you get, the more those carbs are going to need. So I think people think when I say carbs, 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 they're like, well, I'm not working out that much. I don't need to eat that many carbs. I'm like, I'm not telling you to eat 500 grams of carbs a day because you're doing 3, training sessions a week, but it's dependent. So it's like this linear relationship between your training volume and your carbohydrate needs. So I really want to make sure that that's understood here from people, because I think everyone thinks that when I say, oh, you need a lot of carbs or you need to eat carbs, I'm telling everyone that they need the carbs of a marathoner when they're, doing couch to 5K or whatever that looks like. So, eat the macronutrient ratios that you prefer within reason, but as your training volume increases or the intensity or duration or how much you're doing each week, the amount of carbohydrate you're going to need in your diet is going to go up to some degree. Yes, your body can, make carbs out of proteins, which isn't ideal, or fats if needed, but it prefers to just use carbs as carbs. And it's an easier physiological process for us. And so carbs are the main source of energy during activity. Even if you're using fats, even in like zone 2 training or low intensity or fat burning training, yes, you're using a higher percentage of fat than you are at higher intensity trainings, but you're still using a lot of carbs. And that's coming from someone who has analyzed so much freaking metabolic testing data. That's all I did in my graduate work and my postdoc. Trust me when I say, even your zone 2 training that's building your fat burning or fat burning zone stuff is still using a lot of carbohydrate. And then the more intense you go or the longer you go, the more carbs you're burning. So there's this idea that, you don't need carbs unless you're doing certain things. You absolutely do, especially if you're doing a lot of endurance or a lot of cardiovascular training. That is torching through carbs, and you need that. Lifting, maybe not so much. You do need some carbs to support your lifting and your training and your strength output, but the demands won't be as high as if, you're doing equal minutes of cardiovascular training volume, just keeping this in mind here. But essentially your body store carbs in 2 places, your liver and your muscle, and you have only so much storage place within those. But that is your first immediate line of nutrition when you're doing exercise training. And it will pull from your carb stores in your muscles more often than not. Your liver will release it into your bloodstream that you can then take up into your muscles and use. But it's largely coming from those muscle stores. We also have fat stores in our muscles for energy and metabolism as well. And if those are depleted or your liver is also depleted, or you're not eating enough in general, you are going to feel low recovery, bonky, that like low blood sugar, hypoglycemic. If I walk in a grocery store right now, I'm going to make terrible decisions type feeling. Like you have that brain fog. You can't think of anything, hanger, low blood sugar. I think a lot of people don't realize that is radical to them, that's low blood sugar. They're hypoglycemic, which is the scientific word for low blood sugar. Or their training sessions feel terrible, or their recovery is terrible. And they're not realizing that is this. So my favorite story of this is in 2020, I didn't track my nutrition while I was training for my first 100K. And that's the year of obviously the pandemic and the C word. I don't know if it will censor podcast if you say that on that, but every week I was undereating carbs, even though I know better. And I thought I was eating enough. And essentially what happens is across the week, say you eat a big meal on like a Sunday and you don't eat enough carbs to match your activity across the week, slowly your glycogen stores will only partially refill across the week, and they will go down, down, down. And it was like every other Thursday or Friday, like clockwork. I would literally think that I was sick. I thought I was dying. I was like, oh my God, I have the C word. And then I would order mellow mushroom. If you ever had that, if you live in the American South, I love mellow mushroom. I would order mellow mushroom, which is pizza, or cheesy bread or whatever. And then I would magically be better. And I caught on, which is still, I'm a PhD doing this stuff. So this is just a fun story that I think makes it more relatable to people. Is I just needed food. If you feel better after eating a large meal, then chances are you're under eating carbohydrate, probably primarily carbohydrate or calories in general in response to your training. If that is the thing that magically makes you feel better, that is because by the time you get across your week and you keep training, and you keep pulling away from that storage in your muscle and you're not refilling it or replacing it, and you don't have enough in your bloodstream available to then make up for that loss of that, your body is going to function slower. You're going to have poor power output. You're not going to move as much weight. You're not going to be able to run as fast or run as hard or run as far. That is your body's immediate energy source during exercise training. And I think people worry a lot that all the carbs that they're eating are just going automatically to fat. But a large component are going first to repair and replenish and refill those muscle stores. But also those muscle stores and or the carbs you're taking in with your diet are also being used to fuel the repair processes in your body. The energy systems that are going on in your body during exercise aren't only on when you're exercising. They're also, your muscles are working to repair and recover and use that energy as well when you're done with your training sessions. So, you're not just eating and filling up your fat cells. You're also filling up those little storage tanks in your muscles. And so I think it's really helpful to people to think about that. And I think people really underestimate that if your glycogen stores are depleted, you potentially are going to have heightened hunger because you're going to have this low blood sugar because your body's it's going to be pulling from what you have in your bloodstream. And so you might have this heightened hunger. And that's where I think a lot of people go wrong with saying, well, like cardio made me fat or training for a marathon made me fat. Well, you were under eating carbs, so you weren't satiated. Or what a lot of people do, and this is where I think tracking is helpful, is it's not that fats are bad for you, or I think you should avoid fats, is they overeat their calories from fat or the percentage of their diet from fat in relation to their carbohydrates relative to their overall caloric load. And so in order to meet the carb needs that your body wants and is asking you for, you just keep eating more and more and more to bring in that little bit of trace carbs, but then you're overeating calories because you're eating a ton of fat calories, which are really dense and calorically dense. Again, I'm not saying that you should avoid fats. When I say this, people think that I'm restricting fats. No, I actually have a hard time eating less than 30% of my diet from fat, where 20 is probably that lower limit, 20 to 25 that is kind of recommended. I have a hard time eating less than 30. So it's not like I'm by any means restricting that, but that can kind of stay relative to your total caloric intake that you're having, that 20 to 30%. But then beyond that, your carbs will make up the rest of that caloric intake and increase as you're training. And so what I usually try to encourage people is to focus more on like strict carbs. And so this is where carbs then get a bad rap from a health perspective. They're like, well, that's terrible for you. Carbs are terrible. They're spiking your blood sugar. It's super bad for you. It's unhealthy. And so don't just think about carbs as, yes, you can eat cereal before you run or to fuel or replenish, or candy when you're training, or whatever the things that people do. But also think about your starchy, fibrous, more filling carbs, like a lot of potatoes when I'm training, or
sweet potatoes.
I eat a lot of potatoes when I'm training, or, rice or fruit juices or smoothies. You can still get a ton of nutrients in with that. And then you're also bringing in the fiber component of your diet. It's not that fiber is only in like bread products, whole wheats, whole grains, all that stuff. Yes, it has fiber in it, but you're also getting that in your fruits and your vegetables. And when it comes from an overall health perspective, I'm not an expert on gut health. So this is definitely stuff that I've learned from my friends and peers who are more experts in stuff. And this is coming from someone who actually has dealt with some upper GI classic hot girl stomach problems that we all have. Is that prebiotic fiber that comes from our fibrous foods? That is a thing that is largely contributing to a lot of that health of our gut and or then our body. We're all doing these big fancy things to, fix our bodies and heal our guts and heal our hormones. But like eating adequate fiber intake, which can come alongside of your carbohydrate intake, and healthy, more fibrous, dense carbohydrates also then contributes to your health and your functionality. And then the classic one that everyone likes to say is your brain uses carbs as its main source of energy, which it does. It can use ketones too as well, but you're going to think a lot clearer and be a lot more productive and feel a lot better in general if you're well fed and eat enough carbohydrates. I think that, something that people underestimate for me, besides my crazy training load, is, I run a business. I got a PhD. I did a postdoc. I'm not just, training a ton each week. I'm working a lot. And one of the reasons I'm able to do all the things I do besides sleeping a lot is I eat a lot. I almost rarely, if ever, am in an energy deficit, at least intentionally. Not to say I've never intentionally pulled back or anything at any point in time in my life, but for the most part, I'm the queen of maintenance. I'm the queen of eating enough and fueling my body and using, big filling meals to keep me satiated, to support that as well, that cognitive function, that productive output. And so if you're worried about the glycemic response or all that, if you're eating near and around training, there is a non-insulin dependent like effect of exercise training, which brings these little glucose receptors to your cell wall and brings carbs in without insulin having to tell them to come. So it's almost like two different people that ring at the doorbells. Exercise brings the same glucose carriers to the door as insulin does. So, you're more insulin you're less reliant on insulin immediately post exercise. So a lot of those carbs are going to be shuttled into your glycogen stores without that, which is a good and positive thing. Those muscle contractions themselves stimulate that. A lot of the carbs you're eating like immediately pre or during training are then just kind of being in your bloodstream and immediately being used for energy metabolism. They're not just like going into your storage cells like you're thinking of there. And then in general, if you're worried about it from a meal standpoint, pair your carbs with proteins and fats. That's just like make a whole, complete, balanced meal. And I don't think
we don't need to be doing these continuous glucose monitors of testing an individual banana with no context in the random middle part of the day and look at how much it spiked my blood sugar.
Yeah,
it's taken out of context.
Eat well-balanced meals that contain all the nutrients. Maybe don't eat an entire box of Captain Crunch for breakfast on its own. That's probably an advisable health thing. You right? Like, I mean, I eat a lot of cereal when I'm training. I'm not saying cereal is bad, but like, yeah, your blood glucose is going to spike because that's what your body is supposed to do. That's a normal response to it. The extent to that, the frequency, the duration, the peaks, and how fast they come down, that's where it's more of an issue from health. And that is obviously something that should be managed with, your team. And your long-term chronic response to glucose is more of something you should be worried about rather than like these individual acute ones. But also, you don't want these hyper swings of being hypoglycemic all the time either. You don't want to be hyper swinging between hypo and hyper or hypo and hyper. Like you can kind of be more euglycemic, so to speak, across the day in a normal fashion and pattern if you just have normal balanced meals. And or if you're a very active and highly active person, you are more sensitive and better at using fats or carbs as you take them in and eat them. This is called metabolic flexibility. This is what my dissertation was on. And if you have a higher cardiovascular fitness status or you're more active in general, you're going to be more sensitive and better at using these and having less of that systemic stressful response as somebody who's maybe sedentary or has poor fitness status. So I think that like sometimes the healthiest people are the ones that are micromanaging stuff about them that is not even an issue, that the fitness status itself ends up taking care of for most of it. Like this is why we would encourage the more sedentary people who are struggling with these things to be more fit, because it helps make your body more efficient at managing and regulating and using these things. And so it's this beautiful combination of fitness status helps negate a lot of those problems that we see with this, but you need the food and fuel if you're doing these higher levels of training or you are a very highly active person, which I'll classify here. If you're doing between like 300 and 500 minutes or more of exercise training per week, which is like the 5 to 10 hour range, you probably need to be eating a little bit more carbohydrate or a little bit more than you think to support that rate. If you're exercising like an hour to 90 minutes per day on average across the week, or doing a lot of high intensity, which I know a lot of women, what they'll do is like the high intensity group fitness circuit classes and be like, well, I'm just exercising generally, but they're doing 5 or 6 Orange Theory classes a week and then eating like their mom did in this, like it growing up when she was like a Special K mom, right? Like that's where we see this mismatch of these things. So even if you don't have the goal of training for a race, or you don't have the goal of doing something specific, like if you're training at these higher volumes or high intensities frequently across the week, carbs are going to help support your recovery and your performance. If you're worried about cortisol, carbs can blunt or reduce the cortisol effect. Or if you're fed before the training, it's going to be less stressful on your body. Matched with if you're worried about your hormones, energy availability, it can be mimicked by low carbohydrate availability in females, and that can send the same stress signals or underfeeding signals that we get from not eating enough across the day or in general to our bodies. So I don't want to say that like everybody needs to just go start drinking straight like corn syrup. Like that's not what I'm trying to say here, but you need to be eating adequate carbohydrates to support that. It's going to support a lot of the things that you're worried about that are happening to your body, that are the boogeyman of the fitness industry has put out there. Usually comes from eating enough. And often if you're doing high volumes or high intensity, carbs is supporting both your health, your hormonal, and your performance goals within that.
So I think that something you touched on is very important, and it's something that people don't realize. The body is always tuning in to its energy status level. Like it's always paying attention, because it would be silly of the body to push a high metabolic rate if it knows there's not enough energy coming in. That would be a death sentence for the body. And something that many people in the low carb space don't discuss is that carb availability is another signal. So it's not just calorie intake. There's also like the body's assessing carb availability. And there's plenty of research studies showing this, that when carb intake is low, that serves as a signal, and T3, active thyroid hormone, isn't produced as much. Reverse T3 levels are increased in active thyroid hormone. And muscle glycogen availability, that's like another signal that the body's tuning into. If you're depleted in muscle glycogen, that's sending a signal to the body as well. So in the strength world, workouts, there's research showing that you see like a 40 to 60% muscle glycogen depletion level after a standard, strength workout, resistance training workout. So essentially, for the audience, that's saying that your muscle glycogen levels have been depleted by 40 to 60% just from a strength workout. Do you know what the research says for endurance training? Do you know how much like a zone 2 session or a jog will deplete muscle glycogen levels?
So essentially, it depends on the intensity and duration. So it's an it depends thing. But in a training session that's very intense, as low as like 30 to 60 minutes can fully deplete them. As something that's more high intense or longer duration, moderate intensity can 60 to 90 minutes. So that's why the carbohydrate refueling recommendations for endurance training are to start eating for anything that's at least 90 minutes or longer. But you can fully deplete your glycogen stores in your muscle anywhere between probably like an hour to 2 hours of activity with endurance training. If it's really, really intense, potentially fully and less. But yeah, I mean, you can, and it also depends on your starting state of it, right? So yeah, if it's really, really intense, the less time you need to fully deplete them. But if it's more moderate and continuous, yeah, you can deplete them within a standard 60, 90, 120 minute workout. That's why the idea behind carbohydrate feeding during endurance or cardiovascular activity is to not try to refill the glycogen stores while you're training, but have glucose available in the blood so you're not having to use your glycogen stores, so you can delay the depletion of it for as long as you can during that activity and training. Because once it's kind of depleted, you're kind of you're not sending the same signals for repairing and replenishing and restoring that until you're kind of done with training. So you're trying to prevent that as much as possible. So yeah, I'd have to look up again like the exact durations of it, but there's this great
that shows
there's this great figure that I used when I taught undergrad exercise physiology lab that has like different lines of the duration versus intensity of activity, and you can deplete your glycogen stores fully with an endurance training session, just depending on the duration and intensity.
So the audience really needs to let this sink in. Like, if you have depleted glycogen levels and then you're never fully refilling those with sufficient carbohydrate and calorie intake, you're going down this negative path, and the body has to pull resources from somewhere. And so it can pull from your muscles. And so people are kind of going in an opposite direction of what they want, which is more muscle, better metabolism, look better, look more full, if they're not matching their carbs and calories with the output.
Yeah, so one of my favorite fun carb facts is that carbs are protein sparing. So if you have enough carbohydrate in your body, so your body will preferentially use amino acids. There's some amino acids are essentially carbohydrate backboned, and they will be broken down and put into like the citric acid cycle. It's an energy metabolism cycle in the body. So they'll be broken down and shuttled and turned into some of those intermediates. So not all amino acids, but some of them. So your body will more preferentially turn protein into carbs. It can indirectly use fats for carbohydrates, usually through breaking down like the triglyceride like body, not the actual like fatty acid chains attached to it. So you really don't have this direct pathway of making carbs out of fat. I think a lot of like high fat people always like want to push like, we don't need carbs because it will make it. And yeah, eventually your body will, make enough through other means. But we do see some data, with issues with the high fat diet without enough carbohydrate, where it does potentially impact muscle growth. I know there's some people in the space who have such high training levels, they end up eating a pretty good amount of carbs despite that. And those are kind of more nuanced conversations that are probably beyond the scope of like this right now. But with that being said, carbs are protein sparing. So if you're eating enough carbs in your diet, your body is going to, one, support muscle growth and retention, or two, not break down the amino acids or muscle tissue in order to get the nutrients it needs to fuel what it's trying to do. So yeah, carbs are protein sparing. That's my favorite little fun carb fact there.
Yeah. So something that you mentioned was, I loved your example in 2020, how you literally, all this information, yet you still got caught up in that, you were unintentionally under fueling and then you were starting to feel sick. So a lot of our audience isn't probably thinking that this information, like I said in the beginning, is relevant for them because maybe they don't identify as an athlete. But have you seen in your athletes or people that you've maybe, that were in school with you or other athletes that you worked with, how much negatively or not matching their proper fueling for their nutrition and exercise can impact their health? the health outcomes of not eating enough carbohydrate or fuel?
So what I end up seeing is clients who I'll catch it sometimes where they'll message and they'll list all these things that they're struggling with. And I'll say, are you getting a regular cycle? And they're like, no. And I'm like, you need to go talk to a doctor. And I caught a client who had a stress fracture for that because she was under eating in response to that. So you have this risk of, I don't think people recognize like loss of menstrual cycle is a negative health impact. Even if you have a cycle, but it's being impacted where you're not ovulating or you're having luteal phase deficiency, which is essentially you didn't ovulate, your progesterone's low, you're having shortened truncated cycles or very light menstrual cycles because you're not fully developing the uterine wall lining that we lose. Those can all be signs that potentially either thyroid or hormones are being downregulated because your body's trying to preserve energy because it's not getting enough in to support what it's doing. And so I think from a female health perspective, that's important. And males can have the same thing too. Their thresholds for intake can be lower. It's just especially so in women. That carbohydrate intake itself can also impact that perception by our bodies. It's a little bit more sensitive to that. You also have, being hypoglycemic or your body being stressed and trying to release and support you by releasing nutrients to support your body can negatively impact you in many ways. It's not like, oh, I'm really active and I'm under eating, which seems to make sense by health and dieting guidelines, but that's a lot of stress on your body. And you also don't want to be doing that as well. You see this downregulation in metabolism because your body is trying to preserve its energy output and things like that. You might have impacts on your sleep and your sleep quality, which we know sleep is super vital and important for health within that as well. But I will say for a lot of my clients, what I ended up seeing more so is that risk of, you don't think about this in Gen Pop people as much because it's a lot more prevalent in athletes, especially endurance athletes. But you see this, either they are losing their menstrual cycle or having dysregulated menstrual cycle, or I luckily don't deal with a lot of bone stress fractures, but you see that a lot in women, or stress fractures that come with that. That's the hugest things that we see. Or the indirect impacts that we're having that kind of come from that low eating. And that can also impact your cognition, your overall health, your blood work, all of these things can be heightened. Also, everyone, again, is worried about the cortisol boogeyman, but you know what elevates cortisol? You know who has higher inflammatory and cortisol response to training? Women with low energy availability. And so these are all things that are made worse from this. Well, also me delicately talking around, like, I don't want to say everyone's going to have like elevated like lipids in their blood work, or they might end up looking like they have insulin issues or sensitivities, but that's because their blood work, their glucose is going like this all the time because they're undereating, overeating, normal eating. So, you want to think about supporting your body and being on its side and giving the things that it needs to health and function. I think some of the fitness wellness stuff has gotten to the point where we're thinking that some of these things they're like, well, I'm doing all the good things, but okay, too much of the good thing can turn into the bad thing. And so we want to make sure that we are still supporting our bodies and what it needs and where it's at within that. Mixed with, I do still see we're still dealing a lot in a world of Gen Pop people who struggle with weight and all that stuff, where I think that there's this overeating matched with this undereating. I think what a lot of women do is they undereat across the week or they undereat across their day. And then they match that with like a super large hyper surplus of calories, which isn't necessarily the best way to be approaching that either. Within day energy availability is still low energy availability to our bodies. If you live off coffee, a whiff of air, and a leaf of lettuce for half your day, that is not ideal. You want to be eating meals across the day. That's how they eat. And they say, well, I'm not eating that much, but I'm not losing weight, so it must be all these things. But really, if you just had a higher but more consistent level of calories and intake across your meals and your days, remember, eating enough is not overeating, right? But you feel like it's overeating because you take this hyperbolus, super stressful, high calorie craziness that you're putting on your body, right? And instead just spreading it like this across the day. If you're listening on a podcast, not watching, I'm essentially saying, like, take your 3,000 calorie Saturday meal and just add those calories more evenly across your meals across the week. And you'll probably feel a lot better. And you also probably feel like you don't need that crazy 3,000 calorie Saturday meal because you've literally underate the entire week and your body is an animal trying to tell you that it needs something, right? If you don't feed your dog all week, what is it going to do when it breaks into the bag of dog food? Like, you're not broken for being excessively hungry because you're putting that stress in your body. And it's just thinking, well, I need food. Well, yeah, that's normal. But that's where I see it in the other way, right? The people who aren't as at risk of that, and maybe they are the classic, well, I struggle with my weight and I am overeating. I don't need to eat more. And thinking of maybe if the phrasing eat more doesn't align with you, eating more evenly. and eating enough. And eating enough isn't overeating, and start from that.
Yeah. So what you do activity wise, I'm sure many people would say, oh my gosh, that's overtraining, right? For someone who is not eating enough, your level of activity would be considered overtraining because their calorie intake is not matching their expenditure at all. And I would say that other people would say, oh my gosh, she's running so much. That's going to throw away all of her muscle on her body. Clearly not so. So you mentioned earlier that you're the carb and cardio girl. Can you talk a little bit and dispel some common myths of why cardio isn't killing your gains, with, I'm sure, an asterisk of if you're fueling yourself adequately?
So I think that a lot of people, and that's something that I think it's so hard in the online space, because as much as I document my entire journey of training, like you could go watch my whole training for my 100-miler on my YouTube and watch how it changed and shift and fluctuated. But people in the online space, they only pay attention to what you're doing in the single moment, right? That you're doing. So if you see me working out 13 to 15 hours a week, you're going to think, one, that's unrelatable. That's insane. What she says and guides me to doesn't apply to me, right? Two, that's overtraining. You're over-exercising, blah, 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 blah. But if you watch the process of it, which I try to document, not everyone documents that well in the online space, is I build up to that across the year, this past year, right? So one, you're not overtraining if it's a workload, volume, or intensity that your body is physically capable and prepared for. So I want to kind of add this like training little rant here. So your volume or bucket of what you can handle is, I always think, I call it the bucket. Your bucket only has so much water in it. And if you're a low fitness person, you don't have a lot of water in your bucket. You can't pour it out to different cups of cardio or lifting or recovery. You only have so much that you can handle of both or either at any point in time and recover and it not be too stressful on your body. But as you gain fitness, you train more and you gradually increase that over time, you increase the water in your bucket. So you have more to give. You can train more hours. You can do more of both. You can do all those things. So there's a training component there as well, right? If you just jumped into exercising 15 hours a week, you're going to feel terrible, right? And listen, I'm not working out 15 hours a week right now. That's a lot. That was so much. That was hard, right? Like I trained for 100-miler. Like that's so different than some of the things that most regular people are training for. That's the hardest I've ever trained in my life, but I worked up to it. And then two, I already kind of outlined my approach to nutrition as I did that across the year. And so there's this big argument in the overtraining space is it, and even in the low energy availability space, is it the training or is it the food? And can you basically, like, are you either overtraining or are you undereating in some ways? And I do think that sometimes people are overtraining. There's overreaching, which is productive and part of training. It's important to sometimes overreach because then you recover and repair and go into that. So I probably was overreaching the last few weeks of training for my 100-miler, but then I went into this rapid recovery phase of my taper so that I was peaked for race day and my training and my performance, versus the people who are overdoing it all the time and not having either deloads or tapers or lower seasons of training and intensity. So, there's going to, I say that to say, you can't just out eat and train as much as you want, but the elite athletes are training 20, 30, 40 hours a week like it's their full-time job, but they're also eating like it's their full-time job as well. I have to acknowledge that the nicest thing about not training anymore is that I'm not having to eat like I'm a freaking like it's my job. Like that's a lot. It's hard to eat that much every single day. It's a pain. I hate to say that because I know people are like, oh, I'm so jealous you could eat so much. I'm like, it's a pain in the butt to have to do that. I'm like, you're cooking and cleaning and all that all the time. But anyway, all that to say is that, if you're adapted to in training and gradually increasing how much you're doing, you can do a lot more than you think. If one, you're not doing it all high intense, you're balancing your intensity across the week appropriately with good training programs, and you're eating enough to support that. If I went and did the same, say I was at the same level of fitness training capacity volume that I was doing a month ago before I peaked for my race, and I suddenly slashed my calories by 1,000 calories a day, that might then, after a couple weeks, months of doing that, be way too much for my body. I might start getting injuries. I might start getting, impacts on my hormones. I might start putting myself at risk for stress fractures. I might start impacting my training quality, my fitness levels by doing that. But because I matched that with the caloric intake that I needed to support that activity, then it was a completely fine, adaptable, and reasonable amount of training volume, mixed with the fact that I really, again, want to emphasize the training thing because I think women go straight to doing more and intense at the same time. If you're doing more, less of it's going to be intense. The overall percentage of it is going to be lower intensity. That's where that whole zone 2 conversation comes into things. Like if you're only doing 3 20-minute cardio sessions a week, that's very different than running for 10 hours a week when you think about your overall distribution of intensity and volume. So it's kind of like this hyperbole, like this parabola of like, you can have more intensity when you're doing less because you're doing less overall. But the more you start to do, the more it has to come from that moderate to easier intensity exercise. But then the more that you do, the more percentage of your training can become intensity again. But relatively, it's really not that much when you think about how much it is kind of overall. There's a big difference between 10 to 20% of 4 hours a week of cardio versus 10 to 20% of 10 hours a week of cardio. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong of thinking of that. Like zone 2 versus intensity. When is it bad? When is it good? The more you're doing, the more it's going to be easy because you can't do high intensity for all of your sessions. You're going to lose the quality of it, or you're not going to be able to handle all of that altogether. You still have to do a ton of the easy stuff mixed in with that. And then when it comes to the other like cardio debunking stuff, you know, I am a meathead. I'm a lifter by trade. I think it's so funny that I'm known as the cardio girl now and runner. When I am just a little hamster of muscle. I'm a little pocket muscle hamster. So, with that being said, a lot of people think, okay, cardio is going to kill your gains, and cardio will kill your gains if you are, one, overdoing your cardio too fast, too soon. You're not adapting to it. It's too stressful for your body to manage the adaptation to your cardio training on top of the lifting training that you're doing. Two, a lot of people are unwilling to do this. Pull back your lifting a little bit to make room for that new stimulus and stressor you have added to your training. You can't just start slapping things on top of each other. You need to give your body time to adapt and adjust. You will temporarily think that you're losing your strength and your fitness and your gains because you're going to have a slight temporary acute decrease in a performance as you adapt to that new training and stimulus. Again, that same kind of bucket theory that I was talking about before, the more water you have of each of those, the more you can give to each of them. But if you don't have a lot of fitness capacity in one, you're going to have to build that in order to maintain it and have it be, my body knows this. It sees this. It's adapted. It recovers to this. It's not as stressful anymore because it's familiar with the style of training. So then you can kind of do a little bit more of each and build on that over time. And so that mixed with a lot of people say cardio kills your gains. Don't do it. You need good strength training that is focused on high quality work that is heavy. It is loaded to or near failure. It doesn't have to be all the way to failure, within 1 to 4 reps of failure, like a 7 to 9 out of 10 effort. A lot of people are underloading their lifts. I would rather you do less sets or less exercises or less days per week, but make it higher quality. A lot of people make that mistake. They think I need to do more, but they're underloading what they're doing. Less, but higher quality is likely going to be better from a muscle building standpoint or muscle preservation standpoint, especially if you want to train for an endurance event or race. That reduces the volume component while keeping the intensity up, which is going to keep and maintain a lot of those things that you're worried about losing. But most importantly, eating enough protein, carbs, and calories while I'm training at these high levels allows me to maintain most of my muscle mass. And I've trained in the past where I've lost a lot of muscle. When I hyper swung down into the 130, I think I was 132 after my first 50 miler before I start lifting again. I can see those videos and I look really tiny, but you can tell then compared to now how much more muscle mass and muscle density I have. And I'm a naturally muscular person, but I didn't do it right those first few. I experimented a lot my first few years of training ultra marathons and lifting, and I was in graduate school. And so that's where I've learned and made the mistakes that you guys now don't have to. But the last 2 years with training for ultras, I've maintained pretty much the same body density, muscularity, body size, weight with pretty much across the last 2 years because I've eaten enough. I've maintained that high quality lifting focus. And then I do make sure that in the off seasons or lower running training volume seasons, I am ramping up my lifting a little bit more to put on any tissue or muscle that I might have lost or didn't have during that period of time. And that's okay. That's a normal thing to do, taking this seasonality approach. But if you're eating enough, you're following a training program that doesn't suck, and you are sleeping and you are doing things that match your current capacity, you're not going to have cardio completely tank your gains. But if you're not doing any cardio at all, it's going to take some time for your body to adapt to that and get used to that. And you might have to take it slower than you think, but you can handle a lot of cardio volume with your training if you can keep it high quality enough and eat to support it.
And I think the weightlifting part of it is just so important. You touched on there's a huge difference in cardio weights. Let's keep those separate, right? Like, let's not try to do cardio weight classes because that's not putting a strong stimulus on the muscle. I like how you like dial things in when you're doing a lot more endurance training. you take the weight training sessions down, but you still keep them intense to provide an adequate stimulus. And I think a good way for the audience to help monitor whether they're eating enough is to assess, hey, are your numbers in the gym, are they going down? Or are you slowly able to increase or match your weight used and your reps that you can hit? Because if that's going down, then you are pulling from your muscle stores. You are losing muscle. You may be doing too much given your current state. So did you ever utilize your lifting numbers as a way to help assess, I'm not fueling enough, or I am kind of overreaching right now?
Yes and no, because I do have a natural fluctuation with my lifting numbers across the year, especially with fatigue. Some central nervous system fatigue from cardio or endurance training can sometimes mask your strength performance in the gym a little bit. So I really like to use rating of perceived exertion. And if I notice that my RPEs at similar weights are higher than they typically are, or my weight is lower than it typically is at the same exertion, or how I feel in the gym is poorer session to session, I will usually kind of use that as an indication of, okay, well, I probably need to eat more. If I'm hungry in the middle of my sessions, like that are only like 30 to 40 minutes long, that's usually a sign I need to be eating more. Mixed with, I really look at my recovery. If I'm feeling absolutely wrecked, muscle soreness, like super fatigued, like really tired, I'm either doing a little bit too much in my training, or I'm not eating enough to support that. So that's where I usually like will assess and see how are things moving in the gym. For me, that's usually like how fast are things moving? Is my power output being impacted there? That's usually what I'm looking at more, is like how fast am I able to move my reps and sets? And then how is my exertion and my feeling and my perception there, feeling week to week, which there's normal fluctuations that come with that. But yeah, if you're not in like a race peaking prepping season where your weights might not be linearly going up, and you're in like more of a maintenance phase, or you're focused on just doing a balance of both, and you're not making progress in either of those areas of the gym, then yeah, potentially food is the issue that is going on there. I think a lot of people too, they'll say, well, I feel like I'm getting stronger. This actually came up with clients this week. I feel like I'm getting stronger, but I don't feel like I'm gaining muscle. I don't feel like my body's gaining any mass, and strength can be built outside or independent of muscle mass. And so with that client, I know that they've been following our program for a few months. I know what they're doing. They're consistently training. They're showing up. And that's someone who I said, okay, well, like if you're doing this and you're getting stronger, but you don't see your body gaining any, which muscle building is slow, but if you're seeing this for months, I said, okay, well, if you're assuming your protein intake is adequate, I would increase your carbs or your calorie amount to support that training and what you're doing, because that's a good indication too as well. And that's where sometimes having like measurements, if you want to take measurements of things, taking photos and looking at your muscularity, if that's okay with people, or DEXA scans can be helpful. Those are kind of pricey, but people can use things like that just to tune in on that a little bit. But your performance in the gym, if it's poor all the time, something's off.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's really good advice, just to use whatever means that you're comfortable with to track your progress. Don't be afraid to take progress pictures or measurements in order to know, am I fueling enough? And also just how you're feeling. So it's been just over an hour. So usually we wrap it up right around here. So I wanted to just give you the opportunity now to tell our audience where they can find you, and maybe, you're the cardio, one of the cardio queens in the best way possible. That could be an insult or a compliment. You have training programs available online to help people get into this type of training, the hybrid training style. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me primarily on Instagram and YouTube at Docless Fitness, DOCLYSS Fitness. But my training programs are the List Method. So you can find the List Method on Instagram, or our website is thelistmethod.com. And so our whole shtick is hybrid training on your terms. So we have lifting, running, and cardio programs. Either a combined membership that gives you access to all of those, a running only, and we're about to launch depending on or just launched depending on when this podcast comes out. Cardio only options too, as well, for people who just want the cardio to add to what they're already doing. So we kind of have a little bit of everything there in the app, and we do build all the things that I talked about today with the training systems and the seasons and the approaching it in a way that's no nonsense, and pairing it in a way that maintains muscle while doing these things in a way that's recoverable, adaptable, and lets you make progress without overdoing it, assuming you also, of course, are eating in a way to support it. But yeah, you can find that at thelistmethod.com or doclessfitness.com. And there's links from there that will take you to all the other resources that I have, including my podcast, YouTube, and more.
Great. Well, we'll link that in the description for anybody curious. And
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you
Dr.
guys for having
Alyssa.
me on.